Hey, welcome back. I thought I'd do something totally different today and tell kind of a story. And I'm going to call it a story because nobody knows how much of it is actually true and how much isn't. A lot of the stuff just isn't written down or recorded in history. But this is what I believe to be how Freemasonry came to be Freemasonry. There's a lot of controversy about Masonry. Most of it due to YouTube. There's a lot of really conspiracy theories, and I get it. I mean, conspiracy theories are interesting, and I like a good conspiracy theory myself every now and then, but you got to take it with a grain of salt. So here's my story about how I believe Freemasonry came to be. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so throughout all of human history, as long as there have been people on planet Earth, we've built things out of stone. And it was probably the very first really durable building material. People were, making spear points and arrow tips and fire rings. It was probably the first things that they actually kind of built out of stone. And this predates history. I mean, as long as people have been around, they've been doing this. And as time went on, we got better and better at building things out of stone. And then thousands of years go by, and we're starting to build bigger and better things out of stone. You think about things like Stonehenge and Easter Island, those heads that they don't know how they did it. These are massive, massive stones before there was any technology to do that. And eventually we started building huts and then houses. And then we got better and better at doing this. And it became more of a craft and an art and a science. There's a lot of science to it. How do you move these how do you even cut them? How do you cut a stone back in the days when there wasn't steel, there was just bronze maybe. How do you do that? Where they were doing it, and they were building these bigger and bigger and more massive things, and cutting these huge, huge, massive stones that would fit together perfectly. And they got better and better at doing this. It took thousands of years, and it just continued on like that. The pyramids were built out of stone, and somebody had to be smart enough to know how to cut and move and fit these stones into place. And eventually, these people that knew how to do this were really held in high regard because they knew geometry, they knew physics, and before modern mathematics or computers or anything, they figured it out, and they became people who had a very sought after skill and knowledge. And that went on and on and on until really about the Middle Ages. And the church decided to start building big cathedrals all over the world. And they needed a workforce to do that, and an educated workforce. Not educated in the way we think of it today, but people who became apprentices and then learned under a master stonecutter. And that was when masons, operative masons, so there's operative masons, these are people who actually cut stone, and they're called operative masons. And they had to have some system of knowing who is good at cutting stone and who is a master at this and who is an apprentice. And I think the reason that they're called Freemasons is that this was a time when people weren't free to travel. If you were born in a little village you kind of belonged to that village, and, and you weren't free to go. You were supposed to work the land of whoever the landowner was then. But a Freemason was free to travel, and it was some of the first people who weren't royalty or somehow connected to kings and queens and land barons, just craftsmen, working people. Some of the first people that were allowed to actually travel to other countries and build these cathedrals. And it really grew into a kind of a craft that had to regulate itself, because you wouldn't want to hire some stonecutter that you didn't know and put him on a big job cutting a big stone if he was only an apprentice or if he didn't have any skills at all. So they started to organize themselves into stonecutter guilds, kind of the first workers' union, kind of. And this was a time before literacy. So most people didn't know how to read or write. And sometimes they'd be traveling to a foreign country with a foreign language. So they needed this system of being able to tell who was who and at what level of a stonecutter you were. And that's where handshakes and signs and words were given to an apprentice. And then when you reached another level, you learned different signs and words that you could say to the person to present kind of your resume. And I think that's where it all kind of started. And they were not only teaching stone cutting, but they had to teach ethics too, because you don't want to give stonecutters a bad name because they're going to go to another country or another city, and you want to maintain the reputation as a professional workforce. So there was a code of ethics, and there were certain signs and symbols and maybe grips, handshakes, that you could present to a new job site to let them know, hey, you're a master and you can be trusted with this massive stone that we're going to pick up over people's heads and put into place. So I think that's where the first stonecutter guilds started, was a little bit before the Middle Ages and into the Middle Ages, when they were building these massive and beautiful cathedrals. So these stone cutting guilds are the precursor to Freemasonry as we know it today. And I'll tell you now how those two things got connected. So it continues like this for a long time, and they build all these cathedrals. The stone cutting guilds become more and more sophisticated and more organized. And then at some point, there starts to be a decline. There's new technologies for building. The church is not spending as much money on cathedral building, and they're spending money on different things, I guess. And being a stone cutter is not as sought after. And this was a gradual decline as all these different things come about. But these stone cutting guilds have become very organized and huge organizations, and they were employing lots of stone cutters, and they needed a way to support themselves, to keep these guilds in place and keep things going for the few stone cutters that were left. So they needed more participation from other people who weren't necessarily stone cutters. And that's where speculative masonry came in. So they started to accept people into the stone cutting guilds who weren't necessarily stone cutters. So that you had the operative masons, who were actually the craftsmen, the stone cutters that actually went out there and cut stone. But then you had other people who just wanted to join the organization and support the stonecutters, kind of Patreons of the day. They just wanted to contribute and keep this craft alive. So there were speculative Masons and operative Masons. And they started to have more and more speculative Masons in guilds and less of people who actually cut stone. Soon there were guilds out there that were just speculative. There were no actual stonecutters in there. There were just people who were keeping these traditions that maybe were hundreds of years old at that point alive. And they were all over the world. And they're pretty disorganized. They weren't unified in any way. There was no Grand Lodge anywhere. So it came to a point where there were some guilds that had no stonecutters in it. They were all speculative Masons. And they were still trying to keep the traditions, those signs and symbols and the code of ethics. They're trying to keep those alive. And they were probably supporting the few guilds that did still have some stonecutters in them. And but they were disorganized. There was no central governing body. There was no consistency in the work. And these are just all my ideas. This is not written down anywhere. And eventually it came to the point where there were no actual stonecutters who were Masons. And it was all speculative, or the vast majority was speculative. So you had these guilds, which later became known as lodges, where men from the community would come together and discuss events and things in the community, projects that needed to be done. Maybe it was like the first civic groups. And it was the first organizations that you could be a duke or you could be a baker. And when you entered the guild or the lodge, you're all on one equal plane. You're all equal. And that was unheard of at the time, where equality between people didn't depend on your status, whether you were connected to royalty or you were a bricklayer. You know, everybody, when they walked into lodge, they were equal. And that was a brand new and probably scary thing to a lot of people who held power, whether you were royalty or way up in the church clergy. That may have been a very scary concept, to have people meeting who were, once you entered there, you were just considered equal. And your opinion was just as valid as anybody else's, where your thoughts and opinions were just as valuable as anybody else's. Brand new concept in the world. And I think what was probably more alarming to the church at the time was that men of different religions were meeting all in the same place to have discussions about things that were going on in the community. And they were doing this behind closed doors. So you would have Muslims and Jewish people and Protestants and Catholics were all coming together in the community and meeting behind closed doors and discussing things that, projects that needed to be done in the community. Totally unheard of. And I think that was the first seeds that were being planted that led to kind of the equality and democracy that we see in the West now. Wasn't like that back then. So I think, and they didn't get it all right. It didn't just all happen overnight, but I think that was just the first seed of equality and a a more level playing field for everybody. That idea of that. I think that is where it was first being put into practice. So you can tell how long it's taken to film this. I'm finally in the shade now, which I'm thankful for. So at this point, there are all these lodges that are scattered out throughout Europe, and they are starting to get the suspicion and ire of people who are in power, government, monarchies, and of the church. And I guess they felt like they needed to become more organized and kind of get some consistency. And that's when in 1717, at the Goose and Gridiron in London, a tavern, some of the larger and more prominent lodges came together and decided to make a governing body of Freemasonry, which was speculative at that point. And they came together and created the Grand Lodge of England. And that was the first governing body of Masonry, Freemasonry. So I'll end it there, and thought this might be an interesting topic. I'm a Master Mason and a 32nd degree Mason in Scottish Rite, and I've enjoyed it, and I like that it's an organization where men and women, there's a Eastern Star, that's the women's Masonry, and people of just any walk of life, doesn't matter religion, race, creed, anything, they're welcome to come and join and kind of keep these ancient traditions alive. What I like about it is that the same words that I'm learning to speak and these same signs and symbols and things like that are the very same ones that Paul Revere, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Richard Pryor, and Neil Armstrong, that all these other men have learned and spoken and kept it alive. Count Basie, tons and tons of people. And people that we don't know, people that are really famous and rich, astronauts, presidents, and, carpenters and bricklayers and auto mechanics. And we all just come together and try to keep these ancient traditions alive. And there's a lot of conspiracy and fake information out there, which I kind of like. I kind of like that there's this mystery to it. I like those Dan Brown novels that kind of try to tie the Templars to, and that might be true, I don't know, to Freemasonry. And I don't know, I think that mystique kind of draws some people in, but then I think when they get there, they find out that it's just a good group of people that meet and support each other. All right, well, I'm going to leave it at that, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye.